Hi everyone and welcome to week 8. We're going to start a new section of the class and we'll be talking about race and the effect it's had on public policy. It's been quite significant throughout the world, but we'll be focusing on the US. We'll be using the book The Sum of Us. It was the class's favorite book of the course last time I taught this. All of the other books were different. That's actually the only one I kept from last time because it was their favorite. So hopefully you all will enjoy it and get as much out of it as they did. So Heather McGee starts with this question of why can't we have nice things? And so the book is going to be framed a little bit around answering this question in terms of like the ways in which racism keeps all of us from having nice things. The answer is not actually found in Taylor Swift, unless the question was, what do unless the question's what do my daughter and I listen to every time we're in the car. It's not a complaint, by the way. I really like Taylor Swift. It's just like the only music that we overlap on. Okay, part 1 of this book, Drained Pool Politics. Okay, so I want to talk about narrative policy before we really get into it, because you can tell in this book that she's setting up these two sort of narratives that we'll come back to. But narrative policy framework is a framework for studying the policy process that starts by assuming that participants tell stories. And those stories have consistent structural features, such as characters, morals, and plots. And so this is from, the textbook that often goes along with a course like this. And it's one of the newer theories, and it's a pretty sharp contrast to theories that are based more out of rational choice economics or like focus on what does each individual concretely get out of each thing? And, they're calculating all of that. And yes, people have incentives and do react to that, and that's why these theories have mattered. But in the day-to-day, most people often know how to act by putting themselves in a role within a story. Like, it is a way human beings have learned to make sense of the world. So it makes sense that it's also a way we would make sense of our politics. And there's some books outside the discipline that I think make a pretty strong case for narrative theory, and are also just very good books. Sapiens, which is of general interest, although it is anthropology history about the history of human beings, but also, likes to get into these sort of big picture notions and is a very entertaining read. And After Virtue is a moral philosophy text. It's not as written for a general audience. It's also a very good book if you ask me, but unless you are into philosophy, you are unlikely to enjoy it, whereas Sapiens is more general interest. Okay, so the book I really want to talk about, though, that gives a really good example of narrative policy is Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. And she went, and this was in the Tea Party era, so pre-Trump. She's going and trying to understand, like, what are the stories that are really motivating the Tea Party movement and the right. For one thing, we have people who are very close to the land, clearly care about the environment, and they're voting for politicians that are enacting policies that are quite bad for the land that they live on and rely on for their living in many cases. So, like, she wanted to figure this out. And she started, this project by going down to Louisiana and talking to people and trying to understand. And she came to this idea that we have a deep story. A deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment. It removes facts. It tells us how things feel. And she says, I don't believe we understand anyone's politics, right or left, without it, for we all have a deep story. Okay, so she's going to say that the deep story on the American right, and I just touched on, this first bullet point, unfolds in several scenes. So she'll say scene 1 is waiting in line. You're patiently waiting in a long line leading up to a hill. Top of the line is the American dream. You feel stuck. Your work, again, this is Lake Charles, Louisiana, has involved dangerous chemicals, long hours, layoffs, very few or no raises, and the prices of food, housing, and education keep going up. And in theory, you wish everyone well, but you've been patiently waiting a really long time to get to the top. So that's our basic setting. Scene 2, the line cutters. You see people cutting in line ahead of you. some through affirmative actions, some through welfare benefits and other initiatives. Black people, women, immigrants, refugees, and even environmental considerations have all cut the line ahead of you and your needs. So she says, you feel uneasy. It has to be said, the line cutters irritate you. They are violating rules of fairness. You resent them and you feel it's right that you do. So do your friends. Fox commentators reflect your feelings, for your deep story is also the Fox News deep story. You're a compassionate person, but now you're being asked to extend your sympathy to all the people who have cut in front of you. So you have to have your guard up against requests for sympathy. Scene 3, betrayal. Someone should be monitoring the line, like the government. But instead, President Obama, again this is Tea Party era, seems to be on the side of the line cutters. You see him waving to the line cutters. He's helping them. He feels extra sympathy for them that he doesn't feel for you. He's on their side. He's telling you these line cutters deserve special treatment, that they've had a harder time than you've had. You don't live near the line cutters. You don't have close friends in those categories. But from what you can see or hear on Fox News, the real story doesn't correspond to his story about the line cutters. So that overall is the story that Hochschild finds seems to be motivating the right. And she went and she told the people she interviewed that this was how she distilled their story, and that they found that analogy of like waiting in line and being cut and the violations of fairness that involves really resonated with them. So, there's decent grounds for thinking that this is, it's not the only deep story that people have. Like, there are many people voting for many reasons, but it's one of them. So there's a bunch of stuff behind the deep story. One on race. The conservative definition of racism is using the N-word or hating black people. The liberal definition is more that there's a belief in a natural hierarchy that places black people at the bottom. Or even on the left, we might go further and talk about racism as being any sort of systemic inequality based on race, right? And this is very different than what conservatives generally mean when they say racism, right? It's not just a question of beliefs or a question of systems and institutions. Like, if there's not open hatred, it's not racism. And so there's a lot of confusion when like liberals are saying, well, such and such is racist. And, like when we're defining the word differently to start with, very hard to talk about. But it also is true that like race forms a sort of natural barrier in general. It tends to cause there to be distance that has to be bridged, that has to be like actively bridged. And so, you talked about like, don't live near the line cutters, don't have close friends in those categories. And so, like opposition to affirmative action and so forth can easily come from this idea of, there are people who are in fact very different than me, that I'm not familiar with, that are getting special treatment. This seems unfair, right? Gender is also a part of it. There are more men than women that are Republican, and then even more that identify with the Tea Party. And even within the Tea Party, there's actually a gender gap on issues like parental leave and some other broad-based government benefits. And then finally, the other thing that's interesting here is even if you bought into this whole story, the free market is not necessarily an ally. But once betrayed by the federal government, the free market becomes the most obvious available ally of the American dream. Okay, so the two stories that frame the sum of us are the old story, where we have this zero-sum racial hierarchy, and the narrative is that white people should see the well-being of people of color. This is summed up as a narrative that white people see the well-being of people of color as a threat to their own, that they are in fact cutting in line, and the line only moves at the speed it moves, only so many people make it to the top of the hill, right? Like, this is a zero-sum story. Any advantage for someone comes at a disadvantage to others. That's how lines and line cutting work. And this has also been, a story that has been told. And the new story is this idea of positive sum racial equality. And what this book is going to focus on is the idea that racism has actually harmed everyone. As she says in the introduction, racism is a poison first consumed by its concoctors. Okay, drained pool politics. So public goods, there's a technical economic definition, which is a good that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So non-rivalrous means that if someone uses it, you're not precluded from using it, and there's no practical way to prevent others from freely using it. So a park is not technically a public good by this definition. While it's mostly non-rivalrous, it can be subject to overcrowding, so there is at least some sense in which at a certain threshold enjoying a park is rivalrous. But also, like, there are private parks. You could prevent others from freely using parks. Like, we have the technology to do that. So there are very few things that are strictly public goods from the economic definition. Most are somewhere on a spectrum. And obviously we have public parks, and most of us would think of these as public goods because they're provided publicly, and they are in practice not excluding people. But just so that it's out there, because you'll cover it in an economics course at some point, or run across an economist who is being very precise about what they mean by public goods. I'm generally going to refer to public goods, more broadly and more of their everyday use. Something that large segments of the public benefit from and wouldn't be adequately funded without a coordination mechanism to fund them. The coordination mechanism wouldn't, per se have to be the government, but it is generally a good coordination mechanism because it prevents, people from freeloading in the sense of everyone puts in some amount of money, and then this public good is produced, like, roads, libraries, etc. Okay, so what happened is during the initial era of integration and civil rights, multiple cities decided to drain their public pools rather than share it with their black neighbors. Now, this meant that, like, all the white families lost a public resource as well. From the book, uncomprehending white children cried as the city contractors poured dirt into the pool, paved it over. To defy desegregation, Montgomery would go on to close every single park and padlock the doors of the community center. And cities all across the country did the same thing. And I should note, like, there are direct long-term impacts you can trace to today. Drowning is the number one killer of young children in the U.S., and black kids are 2 to 3 times as likely to drown as white kids. Is this all public pools? Unclear, but, public resources, teaching kids to swim, all of these things are important and can help. So defunding public goods, and this is really the crux of the argument, and in a lot of the book we'll get into more examples and go category by category, but she's arguing that racism works against non-wealthy white Americans in 2 ways. It lowers support for government actions that could help them economically out of a zero-sum fear that it could help the racialized undeserving as well, and the racial polarization of our system has forced a choice between class interest and perceived racial interest. And in every presidential election since the Civil Rights Act, the majority of white people chose the party of their race. It's important to remember here that drained pool politics isn't just about pools. It's also about college education and state funding for public colleges like the University of Kentucky. Mass incarceration, healthcare, childcare, infrastructure, all of these things are impacted. Another thing to point out is that there are also a lot of government benefits that don't often get recognized. So there's this great book called The Submerged State by Suzanne Mettler. 57% of people claim to never have used a government program. 92%, though, later will acknowledge that they have when specific programs get named. So the real number who benefit might be higher. For example, 529s and mortgage interest deductions have the highest rate of people who use them saying they've never used a government program. These are tax benefits that help people. Tax expenditures are actually close to 1/2 of federal discretionary spending, so this is not an insignificant benefit. Employer health insurance is a big one, that people who have health insurance through work benefit from a tax deduction that makes that cheaper for your employer, makes it slightly cheaper to hire you. In theory, some amount of that flows into your salary. The economics of how that all works out is complicated, and it's not 100%. But some of it does, in fact, benefit the person receiving the health insurance. The mortgage interest deduction is about 4 times the size of housing programs for the poor. So we spend, four times as much on people who can already afford homes as we do on people who cannot. And then retirement savings are also a very large source of spending. So there are several, but those 3 are by far like the biggest tax expenditures out there and are also very, very commonly used. So the reason we're talking about this as a submerged state is like people don't know that they're getting government benefits even when they are getting government benefits, and this prevents like meaningful opinions about them. They aren't aware that they exist. So she found that the greater the number of tax breaks an individual had benefited from, the more likely he or she was to disagree that government had provided an opportunity for an improved standard of living. Right? So the more government programs in the form of tax expenditures that people benefited from, the less likely they were to realize that government was, in fact, improving their standard of living. Okay, I've got a lot of questions about this. I think, this is just a really rich framework that McGee has provided and a really, great way to dive in. Look forward to discussing this with all of you on Slack.